Mike had been doing the craft fair circuit for 30 years. Folding table at dawn, the dry Santa Fe air that smelled of pinyon and dust. A careful display of bowls and spoons sanded to a smooth, warm grain. He priced things low, not because he couldn't ask for more, but because some private pressure always eased him downward the moment a sale looked certain. A sudden miscalculation, a phone call he let go unanswered, a last-minute impulse to fix something that ruined the display. It had become a rhythm in his life, a small sabotage that kept success at arm's length. By November, the pattern felt like a bruise he could not stop checking. By the night the bright object fell, he was tired in a way that felt deeper than lack of sleep. If you watch and this touches something in you, please take 2 seconds to subscribe and turn on notifications. Stay with the full story. There's a clear ritual in here that he learned in the dark, and you'll want to hear the words he used, the breath work, and the tests that followed. The road north of town was a black ribbon under a thin, indifferent sky. Mike's pickup creaked as he pulled off the asphalt and killed the engine, breath steaming in front of his face in sudden cold. The object hit the mesa with a flare that threw his dashboard into harsh white, then an afterglow like a distant thunderhead. He left the truck with his jacket collar turned up against the wind, every muscle awake, and walked toward the smell of ozone and scorched juniper. On the slope, he found a shape, not the metal and jagged ruin the movies promised, but a compact thing wrapped in something like fabric and leather, the stitching too precise for anything local. Near it, in a shallow depression, a figure stirred. At first, it was only the impression of motion, a problem of the brain resolving light into meaning. Then it blinked. Mike moved with the reflex taught by a lifetime of practical work. Hands first, eyes steady, speak low and simple. He said, "You okay?" out loud, because the body knows how to make sound when it hopes to anchor another life. The answer that came was not a voice in the air, but a line of thought that touched him like a hand on the back of his neck, clear, patient, and without hurry. "I am called Tar," the thought said. "There is no harm. You have done the human kindness of stopping." He staggered because telepathy was not a tool in his usual kit, but the sensation was practical and not theatrical. It carried the same economy he loved in woodwork. The figure was small, limbs wrapped, light reflecting off an object at its side. A bag that seemed impossibly intact for something that had traveled a long fall. The stitching had a geometry that slid under Mike's fingers like a tune he recognized but could not name. Tar, the name came as both sound and image, like a signature dropped directly into his mind. Was patient while Mike eased the bindings and helped the strange human-like beings sit up. The creature's faces were not grotesque. Its eyes were large and black with a faint inner shimmer, and when it breathed, the air smelled faintly of metal and resin, like a new tool. It watched Mike with an intensity that made him feel seen in a way that was almost terrifying, as if someone had taken a fine rasp and scraped all the excuses clean. Then, again without moving its lips, the telepathic line offered a simple explanation. "Our device carries memory. It is not for conquest. It is for return." They sat on the cold ground, and Mike learned the bag's secret when Tar opened it. The zipper, not a zipper he had ever seen, but a fold that unlatched on a whisper of pressure, revealed a mirror no larger than a cutting board. Its surface was not reflective like steel. It swallowed and curved light inward, giving him the feeling of standing at the rim of an old well. Embedded around its edge were tiny inlays like metalled glyphs, precise and worn, but not aged. The creature touched the rim, and a shiver ran through the air. "This is a soul surface," Tar presented quietly into his head. "It shows where a pattern knits itself into the living thread. You have been stepping on a taut line. If you want, see." Mike pressed his palm to the mirror because the action felt less foolish than the thought of refusing. The surface did not cool to the touch so much as it adjusted to his attention, and the world eased away. The juniper smell, the damp in his collar, the distant hum of tires on blacktop. In its place came the sensation of being moved backward through a narrow door, not dreamlike, but organized, as if a book had been opened to a particular passage. The first scene walked into him like a cold chapel lit by a single candle. He was a friar in a simple brown robe, the rope at his waist heavy with meaning, and the winter stone under his sandals pressed into his bones. The life smelled of lavender and boiled barley. The work was small, a careful mending of spoons for a brother who could not see well. He had vowed to poverty, the mirror said without judgment, to bind his hands from gain, lest pride seed another wound. The vow felt coherent. In that lifetime there had been greed turned violent, a political scrape that broke a man he loved. So he had stepped into a garb that cut appetite into a daily discipline, and the rope around his heart had tightened with a sense of righteous protection. A ripple of recognition went through Mike, who was watching his own face in the soul surface. The same stubborn neatness of tool use, the same careful eye. The friar had set a rule for his soul, and the rule had become a program, an automatic brake on any approach to increase. In the mirror, it sat like a small, practical knot, noble, hard, effective. Then the surface shifted again, and the light altered, hot now, the air thick with incense and the rust of papyrus. He was a scribe, bent over a table by oil lamp. Reed quills, wet pigment, the careful application of value to memory. In that life, the vow took a different form, a pledge to guard secrets, a solemn agreement to withhold the thing a person most desires, because revealing it in that time would have endangered others. He saw his own hands stained with ink, choosing to hide a ledger that could have saved a family. The decision had cost a life, but prevented a war. The mirror showed how the vow had been both protection and a lock. The rope at his chest felt as if it had become braided there, an addition to the monk's knot. The third image was cold and thin with altitude. A low cave smelling of boiled tea and old wool. A face pale with fever, breaths shallow as wind over stone. He was a practitioner at the end of a long solitary practice in a high place, and the vow then had taken the shape of renunciation. To give up attachment to any outcome, to let the world do what it will. The rope in that life was the last binding before death, chosen to ensure the soul did not cling to failing flesh. The mirror showed him choosing it with hands that trembled from age rather than fear. Each vision landed like a set of screws tightened exactly into place. The mirror did not blame, it catalogued. The rope image repeated in different fabrics and climates, a cord at a friar's belt, a braided thread against a scribe's chest, a thin rope settling over a thin monk's ribs. In Mike's body, a long-lodged constriction loosened like a taut glove sliding off a hand. He had long named his reluctance to charge properly or pursue a contract bad luck or not my market. The mirror placed the origin. Vows made for reasons that had once saved lives, now acting like a hand that keeps his pocket closed. Tar's telepathic line rested in him like a soft instruction. These are agreements. They can be seen, heard, and lifted. Back on the mesa, under a sky finally turning milky with dawn, Mike listened to the way Tar laid out the measures. The creature spoke simply about mechanics, a soul mapping, a knot, a ritual that did not humiliate but permitted the knot to unweave. There was no promise of instant fortune, no claim that the world would rearrange itself like a theater set. The alien explained in the manner of a repairman. If the mechanism is unhooked, energy that once fed the lock will redirect. If you hold the hand steady when the first test comes, the wiring will not revert. They practiced the method that night, with the bag on his lap and the mirror warmed against his palms. Tar guided him through 3 parts that would become the words he used for months afterward: recognition, validation, release. The phrases were short and coarse enough for a man whose trade had him working with his hands. First, recognition. Mike placed his right hand over his sternum, feeling the thump of his heart through the ribs. He breathed in slow, counting each inhalation, and put into words the knot the mirror had named. "I see you," he said into the hollow between them, voice low and steady. "A vow to deny myself abundance, a vow to hide what might save others, a vow to renounce outcome." Each claim he spoke had the simple tone of naming a tool, not an accusation, just a label on a box. Second, validation. Here, Tar asked him to remember the context that birthed the vow, the fear and the sensible, right action it once held. Mike felt the friar's cold stone, the scribe's lamp, the monk's thin air. He said aloud, "I honor why you served. You kept someone safe then. You were necessary." The phrase was not flattery, but dignified recognition. The mirror showed the rope relax fractionally, as if hearing the truth of its origin made it less defensive. Third, release. Tar instructed him to take 3 long breaths, slow as sanding a bowl, each one a count and a letting go. On the 3rd exhale, Mike was to say steadily, "I release you with gratitude. You have done what was needed. You are freed. Go where you are called." His hand tightened into the leather grain of the bag and then eased. He felt something like a pebble dropping into a deep pool. Mike did it then and there under the indifferent sky. Hand to chest, 3 measured breaths, the names spoken with a voice that did not tremble. The mirror's surface rippled. The rope image in his sternum felt warmer, and then, oddly, lighter. He wept, because he had been carrying more than dust for years. The tears were not theatrical. They were the uncomplicated, practical relief of a man who had been fixing a door with a rusted hinge for decades and suddenly found oil. Afterward, the first tests were small. The next morning he went to the hardware store with a decision already made. There was an old client who needed a new chainsaw to reclaim a fallen juniper for an art piece. Mike had been tempted in the past to overcharge or to underbid so that the contract would collapse into a half-finished promise. He found himself choosing the midline model he actually needed rather than the cheapest or most extravagant. At the register, his fingers did not fumble the question about financing. He paid with a card he had been avoiding using because a small voice always quoted future collapse. Nothing dramatic happened. The machine started, the client was grateful, the work was clean, and Mike slept without replaying the conversation. At his usual Saturday fare a week later, he noticed a different patience in the small crowd around his table. People lingered while he explained the wood grain and the story of the finish. He let himself say his price with a tone of honest worth. Sales were modestly better. Across the parking lot, Jeff stopped by with a pie and a half-joking suspicion. "You still doing that holdback thing?" Jeff had been a fixture at the circuit, a man whose skepticism was born in kindness. Mike told him not everything, but enough about the bag, the mirror, the way the rope had felt, and Jeff laughed at first, then fell quiet in the way of someone listening to a neighbor who had started a strange but earnest hobby. By the end of the morning, Jeff said, "Let me see that mirror." And Mike found himself explaining the 3 steps, the breath pattern, the phrasing. Teaching it softened the ritual into something communal. The practical successes gathered like stones in a small, stable pile. A repeat client ordered a set of bowls. An interior designer who had seen his work at a local gallery called with a request for a custom installation. And then, later, more than he had dared hope, the contract that would become the real test. The designer, clear and decisive, wanted a complete series for a boutique hotel, and wired a deposit that was large enough to make the bank balance look different in a way Mike had not seen since before the marriage that ended. The money arrived one slow Tuesday during a workshop. He pulled up his account on his phone to check, and the screen glowed with a sum that, by his old programming, should have sent him reaching for the nearest hole to hide in. The rope surged like an old reflex. His palms went damp. The chest tightened at the same place the mirror had shown. Images flashed, the friar choosing poverty to prevent pride, the scribe hiding a ledger, the monk's last breath. The old bargains spoke up with justifications that had once saved things and now demanded sacrifice. It would be enough, they insisted. It would ruin other people's balance. It would attract envy. He knew, with a clarity that had nothing to do with reason, that if he let the urge win, he would spend the deposit on unnecessary equipment or give it away in a last-minute performative generosity that collapsed into shame. He sat in his small office above the workshop and felt his heart pan like a trapped animal. The instinct to sabotage felt not like temptation, but like a protective clutch. He remembered Tar's patient voice and the mirror's neutral registry. If he wanted this work to persist, he would have to choose it in the moment. He closed his eyes, set his hand on his sternum with the same exactness of a craftsperson feeling the grain, and breathed. Recognition first, which this time came with a directness born of practice. I see this vow in me now. It tightens when abundance comes. He named it and felt the naming itself act like a lever. Validation followed. I honor that you were necessary to keep someone safe then. The memory of the friar, the scribe, the monk settled in his throat like a comfortable weight. Then release. 3 full breaths, a letting out that counted each exhale, and he said aloud, steady and deliberate, "I release you with gratitude. You have served. You are set free." The words rang in the small room with the same sonic economy a good plane can have when it settles into its track. This time, instead of the rope slackening and staying slack, there was a trembling. The mirror had warned him that old patterns sometimes attempt to re-knit on first contact. The panic rose, sharp, demanding movement. A call to cancel the contract, a sudden need to over-deliver for free, a call to his ex-wife to apologize and give the money away. He felt the old knot pull like a muscle used to twitching. It was the real test. Sit with the fear and keep the hand steady, or act and prove the vow correct. He did not act. He breathed through the tremor, anchored by the ritual gestures, and allowed the fear to be present without consent. The panic subsided, not at once, but in the way a tide eases. Slow minutes, then a middling calm. He opened his eyes, and the bank balance still glowed on the screen, unchanged. The deposit was there. He made the calls required for the installation, sent confirmations, and waited to see whether the pattern would find another way to trip him. Over the next days, things broke less often. Small delays resolved themselves with less effort. It was not supernatural luck. It felt rather like oiling a mechanism so it no longer seized when pressure arrived. Word of the method spread the way small communities spread any helpful thing, clumsily, lovingly, with skepticism folded into curiosity. Jeff took the mirror home one afternoon, practiced the 3 steps in his kitchen, and called back 2 weeks later to say his turnout at a local market had improved. The method didn't make Jeff rich overnight, but it did let him hold a price that matched the work. Mike found teaching the ritual a new craft. The same respect for phrasing and repetition he used when he taught a local youth how to carve a spoon. A handed technique and a humility about outcomes. There were moments of relapse, a delivery mishap that, by old habit, made Mike confess himself to a small, unnecessary act of restitution. A client who delayed payment and provoked the old guilt reflex. But the ritual's strength was in its repeatability. The phrasing worked like a hinge. When doubt came, he put the hand on his chest, breathed 3 exact breaths, and spoke the short lines that took the rope's tension down a notch. The mirror had taught him the language of his own knot, and repetition rewired the motor pattern that had once reached for sabotage. Months after the crash, the bag lay unassuming on a shelf in Mike's workshop, its leather polished by use and by hands that now treated it with the same practical reverence one might give a favorite plane. Tar, whose presence had been steady and non-intrusive from the first night, had become less a constant voice and more an occasional observer in the room. The alien helped in precise ways, identifying what the mirror showed, translating the symbol for him when his hands could not. It never told him how to live. It mapped and indicated. That was its ethic. One clear morning, with the dawn painting the desert a pale gold, Tar said their next part of the work had arrived. A request from the creature's people to recover the bag, to take home the device that had done its work on a human thread. Mike had expected, and perhaps even hoped for, some long speech about destiny. Instead, Tar's thought was quiet, almost tender. "You have learned a method with language that is your own," it said. "We go now, but keep the practice. Use it with care." They went to the place where the ship had landed that first night, a shallow basin where the creosote bushes had a little more green. The ship was still there, low and unassuming like a beetle's carapace. Mike felt a tug he could not wholly articulate, a sense that more than a tool was leaving his life, that some transitional partnership had been wound up and now required unhooking. He could have kept the bag, a piece of proof and comfort, but watching Tar fold it with hands that smelled of metal and resin, he understood the ritual's next lesson: not to clutch proof as a talisman. The departure was not cinematic in any Hollywood sense. The craft rose soundlessly at first, a pressure against the chest like a deep exhale, then a soft wind that slid up his jacket. The light it shed was not harsh but kindly, the kind that makes things familiar in a new way. As it drew away and the horizon opened into broad blue, Mike felt a closedness inside him loosen further. He had left behind no guarantee of uninterrupted ease. He had not been gifted a talisman that forced life into a neat arc. He had been shown a language for his own soul, and given a practice to return to when his hands forgot. In the months after the ship's leaving, the work settled into a durable rhythm. The bank balance held steady, not always rising in dramatic arcs, but enough to pay his bills and fund small investments in the workshop. He taught a handful of peers how to use the three-step method with the same no-nonsense phrasing he had learned. Clients came with quiet enthusiasm, and an interior designer who had once been a test became a recurring patron. The rope image receded gradually, like a scar softened by time and sunlight. There were moments when the old programs tried to reassert themselves. The night before he was due to deliver a large installation, his hands trembled, and a cold logic offered reasons to delay, and thus to abort responsibility. He sat on the edge of his bed, hand to chest, and let the breathwork steady him. Recognition, validation, release. He spoke the words out loud, as if sanding through an old paint, and the trembling eased so he could move with the clarity his work required. Mike began to document what he had learned the way he documented a new joinery technique. Precise, practical notes about the hand positions, the pacing of breath, and the phrasing that felt right in his mouth. He wrote the short script of the ritual into a small booklet he left pinned at the top of his craft table. 3 steps, 3 breaths, the short lines of naming, gratitude, and release. He added a gentle note that the practice complemented counseling and medical care, and that deep traumas should be treated by professionals. The ritual was a tool for soul language, not a substitute for treatment. People who encountered the method responded in different ways. Some took it up as a practice like any other, daily for a week, then only when old pressure returned. Others reported more dramatic shifts. A friend whose hands had always tightened at the sight of money found herself organizing her small studio and putting prices that actually covered her time. Jeff, who had started as a skeptic, organized a small community circle where they practiced the steps together on a Tuesday evening in the back room of a cafe. and the room filled with honest laughter and occasional silences that felt like prayer without the doctrine. Through it all, Mike kept the motifs close. The mirror that had shown him the origins, the rope that had once bound his chest, the bag that had carried memory across time. He used those images as anchors in the practice, teaching apprentices to visualize the rope and name its origin before asking it to release. He taught them to honor the vow's initial protective purpose rather than to scold it. The release had to be a permission, not a dismissal. On the day the boutique hotel opened the installation he had made for them, the lobby filled with light and the smell of new leather and coffee. Mike stood in a corner and watched people move through the space like a river. A woman paused at one of his bowls and ran her fingers across the grain. He felt the old reflexes, a flinch of self-devaluing thought, and then the practiced habit of hand on chest and steady breath. He breathed once, twice, and let the third exhale carry the old rope a little further away. After the ribbon was cut, a woman came up to him, eyes moist. "I read your note," she said, "about the ritual." She held out a small card with her name and the word therapy abbreviated beneath it. "I used it last month," she said. "It helped me show up." She did not expect miracles, she expected steadiness. Mike felt a gentle satisfaction in that. He never turned the bag into a spectacle. It remained for him what it had been, a tool that had taught him how to talk to the knot inside his chest. The ship had left, but the method remained, trained into his body and his speech, something he could hand to another like a plane or a measuring stick. If this landed for you, if a familiar tightening rose in your chest as you read, remember the core shape of the practice. Recognition. Place a hand on your sternum and name the knot plainly. Validation. Honor why it once helped you. Release. 3 steady breaths and the short phrase of granting freedom with gratitude. Use it when you feel the old reflex to withdraw or to sabotage. Repeat it as necessary. Results vary, and for deep wounds, do combine such practice with professional support. There were other things he did not expect. Small friendships that deepened. A repaired relationship with a son who had once resented his instability. And a teaching circle that met monthly to practice and revise the phrasing so it fit different temperaments. He never claimed magic. He only told the honest story of bodily change after repeated, intentional practice. One evening, months after the ship's ascent, Jeff asked Mike, over a beer and a plate of enchiladas, what he thought had changed him most. Mike thought of the mirror's cold surface and the rope image that had lived at his sternum for so long. "Naming it," he said finally. "When you can point a name at the thing that's working in you, it stops running the show." When the call came from a voice on the other side of the continent, someone who had read about the method in a pinned note and wanted guidance to apply it to old family patterns, Mike found himself explaining the steps with the same economy Tar had used. He taught the hand position, the breath count, the short phrases. He added the small practical bits that had helped him. Do it seated when the mind is fractious. Repeat the release phrase in the car when temptation rises. Write the vow down and then read it as a witness before you say the words. These were not prescriptions for guaranteed outcomes. They were ways to embed new motor patterns into a nervous system accustomed to old reflexes. At night, sometimes, he would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands and feel the absence of a certain kind of fear. The rope was not wholly gone. Old habits do not evaporate. But the knot had lost much of its urgency. The craft fair looked different. The tables were the same, but he could place an object on them without apologizing in advance. In the clear light of mornings that came after long, honest work, he kept finding enough reasons to be both grateful and watchful. When the story of the bag had spread beyond his immediate circle, he received emails asking for the mirror device itself or for proof of the ship. He answered with the same careful honesty his hands had learned in woodwork. The mirror had taught him a language. The bag had been an instrument. The rest was application and soundness of practice. He included, in a short note, a reminder that ritual work complements and does not replace medical and psychological care, and that results can vary. Tar never imposed a moral judgment about growth. The aliens' final thought before their departure had been simple: keep practicing. That was all. Mike kept practicing, the way a craftsman keeps honing an edge. The dawns came. The hotel guests checked into rooms that contained his work, and he taught the 3 steps to others who asked, with the same straightforward care with which he measured wood. There was, at last, a small ritual he observed for himself every November. A walk to the place on the mesa where the object had fallen, a touch to the earth, a moment of remembrance. He did not kneel. He stood and looked at the horizon where the ship had once lifted. In that empty, broad sky he felt not proof, but a steadier confidence in his own hands and his own honesty. The rope was a softer thing now, a lesson knit into the life of a man who had learned to name his bindings and gently lay them down. If this story touched you, if a knot you carry has a long story of its own, consider this method as a simple practice to try. Name the knot, honor the reason, breathe and release with gratitude. If you want more guidance, there's a short booklet pinned to the original post with exact phrasing and practical notes. And if the pattern is deep or painful, reach out to a professional as well. If you found something here that helps, please subscribe. Leave a comment with the pattern that shows up in your life, and check the pinned material for a downloadable guide and options for guided support. Your results will vary, but the practice is a steady tool when used with care and repetition. The sun moved over the mesa and warmed the grain in his hands. He set down the mirror on his workbench, covered it with a cloth, not as a tomb, but as a placeholder. There were things left to do, teachings to refine, people to sit with, a life to keep tending. He turned back to the pile of wood waiting for tomorrow's bowls, and felt for the first time in many years that the work could follow him rather than being something he had to hide from. He breathed, placed his hand on his chest, and smiled at the honest simplicity of a man who had learned how to unbind himself. He measured the next plank by the light that fell through the high window, and let the ruler speak before his hands. The bench held the memory of years, faint pencil marks, a small gouge where a joint had slipped, the warm halo of oil rubbed into grain. And in that company he worked with a quiet patience that had nothing to prove. The town moved around him, seasons, tourists in their slow migration, the winter deliveries of the kind of lumber he sometimes searched for by mail order. The mirror stayed folded under its cloth, like a tool left in the corner of a shed. He had not felt the itch to expose it. Showing the thing often felt like taking a private instrument and turning it into spectacle. One morning, before the fair season fully woke, there was a knock he had not been expecting. On the porch stood a woman in a raincoat that still held the memory of distant city weather, rain along its seams. Her hands were rough at the cuffs, not with the same callous as a tradesman, but with the small abrasions of someone who had moved steadily through difficult work. She introduced herself as Clara. "I read the notes," she said without preamble, "the pinned post. I thought maybe you could teach me, or at least tell me the truth." Mike looked at her for a long moment. He had learned these past months to let people arrive at the edge of their need and to measure his answer. He could have said no, could have shielded the particularities of what had happened with Tahar. He also knew that the work he taught, the 3 steps, the breath, the naming, was not proprietary. It was a way of sitting with a knot until it loosened. He gestured her in. The workshop smelled of shavings and oil. He made coffee, and she unwrapped a thermos with a quiet efficiency. She told him, slowly at first, about a life split between 2 cities, between a steady job that paid rent and a creative core that was always deferred. There were family expectations, a mother who had settled in a different faith, an ex who was still a presence in the threads of her days. Clara said the word that always made his jaw tighten. She named the pattern as if she were reading a family recipe. When the anxiety rose, she worked harder. She bought fabric, started 20 projects at once, and then shelved them in a lean toward safety. The routine anchored her, but each night she woke with the feeling of not having done enough, which drove her to do more. "I keep getting stuck," she said, "and I can see it sometimes. I can see the rope, but naming it makes it real in a way I can't always keep under control." He told her about the 3 steps, the hand positions, the breath counts. He did not tell her the whole background of the ship or of Tahar. He spoke of physiology and ritual and of the plain mechanics of learning a new motor habit. He watched her try the hand placement, apprentice eyes studying his hands as if learning a join. He taught her the short phrases, the ones he had written into the margin of his own practice, a name for the knot, an honoring of the reason it existed, and the simple release phrase that told the nervous system it could come down. They worked in silence for a while, the way one knits and listens. The shop held their small, concentrated breaths. Clara's face softened when she found the slow count. Her shoulders, which had lived in a raised, defensive posture, began to find a low resting place against her spine. She read her vow aloud when he asked, not loud, just enough to let the sound be a witness to itself. Mike watched for the habitual rush, how she wanted to comment on every small movement, to rationalize. Instead, she sat with the phrases, and when she reached the last release line, her hand trembled the tiniest bit, then stilled. "Nothing mystical," he said when she looked for signs. "It's practice. The nervous system learns by repetition."
System. He wrote a short reply, emphasizing humility and the need for professional support. And then he stopped feeding the small, hungry engine of attention. The cloth over the mirror continued to be a cloth, not a banner. Spring arrived with a particular light that made the bowls he turned glow like shallow suns. One afternoon, as he sanded a rim to a whisper, a young man came to the shop, carrying a box of small things wrapped in tissue. He introduced himself as Eli, the son of a woman who had been at one of the Wednesday meetings. He had come to return something, an ornament that had been left among a box of donations. Eli stayed for tea. He was raw in a way that made Mike feel both protective and afraid. The knots Eli carried were different from Clara's. They lived as a brittle anger toward the father, a grief unprocessed after a sudden death in his family, a list of questions without answers. He had tried everything, therapy for a season, medication for a while, and then the solid blankness of a new job to keep him busy. He had come because his mother had asked him to, more for the sake of the ritual of coming than for faith in it. They tried the 3 steps together. Eli's release was jagged, a violent inhalation that tipped his shoulders sharply, then a sudden laughter that had nothing to do with humor. He cried quietly, the way someone surprised by the release of a pressure valve might. Afterwards, he sat by the window, looking at the road outside. "Did you always do this?" he asked. Before Tar?" Mike considered the question. In the months after that strange event on the mesa, he had tried to measure where his own life began and where something introduced by the other had influenced him. "I had practices," he said. "I had habits. This amplified an old edge. It gave me a structure to return to when the world felt like a storm." Eli nodded, as if that made sense. "My mother says you saved her," he said. "I don't know if that's true, but thank you." The work kept him honest in small ways. He learned to refuse invitations that felt like exhibitions. He wrote occasional pieces for the local paper about craft, about the ethics of making, and about the way a ritual can be a humble tool. He found a wary satisfaction in answering letters from people who had tried the practice and found relief that changed their nights. He also received one letter that made his hands go still. A man asking, in terse language, to buy the mirror outright. He folded the letter and put it in the drawer. The idea of selling the instrument to commodify something so intimate felt wrong in his bones. He had been offered money before by people who wanted to turn the method into a franchise, who wanted to make retreats and brands. They spoke of capitalization, of scalability. He listened, and then he closed the door. There was a line he would not cross. The tool stayed among those who could respect it as a practice rather than a product.
One evening, as the light unspooled and the town lit its small lamps, Clara knocked again. She had a small pile of fabric with her this time, rolls of cloth in muted tones. She wanted to learn how to set up a table at the upcoming town fair, and to ask if he would mentor her in the basics of selling craft. "I want to stop overworking," she said, "and I want to start finishing things." He agreed. They set a plan, 3 morning sessions a week at his bench, followed by an attendance to the practice for the knot at noon. She learned to plane a board straight, to feel the resistances of a lathe, to mark a rim with a hidden pencil line that would not betray her later. She began to finish projects, and finishing had a small, luminous effect on the compulsion. Each completed bowl solved a small riddle. The anxiety momentarily dissolved into the proof of completion. At the fair, Clara's table was modest and held a few bowls that wore the light well. She did not sell out. Sales were not the point. She watched the traffic of people, and then, when it flagged, she sat with a small sign that read, "Practice available. 3 steps, 2 minutes." People laughed at first, then a line formed. Not everyone was ready, but a few were. Mike wandered between his own table and hers, sometimes teaching, sometimes sanding, sometimes just standing in the middle of the square like a man who had learned to hold still. After the fair, when the workbench was quiet and the town had returned to its normal cadence, Clara came to the mesa with him. He had promised months earlier to show her the place where the object had fallen. The path was dumbed down with the seasons. The wind there always found a way to speak through the low scrub. They stood on the rim of the plateau and looked out. "I'm not trying to make a story of it," Clara said, "but I wanted to see the place." They practiced there together, naming a knot she had learned to call by a new, less accusatory phrase. The wind took the words and scattered them across the canyon. Mike felt again that steadying absence of fear, like a long breath exhaled. He watched Clara speak her vow aloud, and felt something in himself relax. Whatever had happened on the mesa had been a tool, and now the tool lived in people's hands like another well-honed instrument. There were nights when he still woke with a fumbled memory, the single impossible instant of the ship gliding over the earth in a bloom of light, and he would reach for the cloth as if to feel proof. But mostly he found that his life had settled into a different kind of certainty. He made bowls. He taught people how to name their knots. He cautioned them when the patterns were deep, and pointed them to trained hands when he feared he was asked to do too much. The town began to change around the edges. A young couple renovated the old storefront on the corner into a bakery. A school teacher started an evening woodworking class for teenagers. People who had once passed his shop in a blink now stopped to ask about the grain, or to hear a brief instruction on how to sand a handle for comfort. The practice, humble and simple, threaded into the small communal life without trumpets. One morning in late summer, a letter arrived, thin and written in a careful, looping hand. It was from Tar, or at least that was how the closing line read, and Mike read it twice before the meaning settled. The letter held nothing mystical, a handful of observations, a brief encouragement, and the same final thought the alien had sent before departure: keep practicing. Mike folded the page and placed it in the back of the notebook alongside the practice calendar and a photograph of the mesa taken by a friend. He thought then of the responsibility that had seemed to follow the story as if it had its own shadow. There were ways to teach that were show, and ways to teach that were stewardship. He had chosen the latter without grand announcement. Months later, near the end of an autumn that smelled like pressed apples and coal, he delivered a set of bowls to a hotel whose owner was a quiet man who liked artisan objects in guest rooms. The owner gave him a note that enough guests had mentioned finding an odd comfort in the bowls, a small domestic dignity that made travel less disorienting. Mike packed the remaining pieces into his van and drove home beneath the slow turning of geese. At his bench, he placed the mirror on the shelf and covered it with clean cloth. He did so without ceremony. It was not a tomb, he thought. It was a placeholder. There would be more teaching to do, more people to meet who had their own knots to name. He had learned that the practicing was the point, the repetition that steadied a nervous system, not the parable of the ship. He took up a new plank and set the plane to it, the blade singing softly as fibers fell away. He felt steadier now, the rope that had once been a leaden concern, lightened to a teaching thread he could work with, weave into another person's life, and then let go. Outside the shop, the last light slid down the mesa and left the world in a thin, honest dusk. He breathed in, placed his hand on his chest, and began to plane, listening to the work follow him the way a life should.